Rebecca Martinez had dreamed of serving on a warship since she was 12 years old, watching naval documentaries with her father, who had served 20 years in the Coast Guard. Now, at 32, she stood on the deck of the USS Meridian, a guided missile frigate, as the ship's new operations officer. The salt spray hit her face as she watched the crew secure the last of the supplies before their 6-month deployment to the Mediterranean. She had worked 15 years for this moment, graduating top of her class from the Naval Academy, excelling in every assignment, and earning her master's degree in international relations while serving. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as Captain Douglas Hartwell approached her station. Hartwell was a man in his late 40s with graying temples and a reputation for running a tight ship. He had been commanding the Meridian for 3 years, and his crew respected him for his tactical knowledge and unwavering discipline. Rebecca had heard nothing but positive things about serving under his command, which made her excited about the upcoming deployment. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez," Hartwell said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades at sea. "I trust you're ready for what lies ahead. The Mediterranean can be unpredictable, and we need our operations officer to be sharp at all times." Rebecca straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "Absolutely, Captain. I've reviewed all the mission parameters, and my team is prepared for any contingency we might face. We've run multiple simulations, and I'm confident in our readiness." Hartwell nodded approvingly, but Rebecca noticed something in his expression that seemed slightly guarded. She had encountered this look before in her career, a mixture of professional courtesy and underlying skepticism that she had learned to navigate carefully. Despite the progress women had made in the Navy, she knew that some old attitudes still lingered in certain circles. "Good to hear," Hartwell replied. "I expect nothing less than excellence from all my officers. The crew will be watching how you handle yourself, especially during our first major exercise next week. Show them what you're made of." As the captain walked away, Rebecca felt a familiar surge of determination. She had proven herself countless times before, and she would do it again. Her track record spoke for itself, commendations for excellence in navigation, strategic planning, and crew management. She had successfully coordinated complex operations in challenging conditions and had earned the respect of her peers through competence and dedication. The ship's communication system crackled to life, announcing the final preparations for departure. Rebecca checked her watch and headed toward the bridge, where she would spend the next several hours ensuring that all systems were functioning properly. The Meridian was a sophisticated vessel, equipped with advanced radar systems, missile defense capabilities, and state-of-the-art navigation equipment. As operations officer, she was responsible for coordinating all these systems and ensuring seamless communication between different departments. Walking through the narrow corridors, Rebecca exchanged greetings with various crew members. Most responded with professional courtesy, but she noticed a few who seemed less enthusiastic about her presence. This wasn't unusual. New officers always had to prove themselves, regardless of gender. She had learned long ago not to take such reactions personally, and instead focus on demonstrating her capabilities through consistent performance. The bridge was bustling with activity as the final pre-departure checks were completed. Rebecca took her position at the operations console, where multiple screens displayed real-time information about the ship's systems, weather conditions, and communication networks. She ran through her pre-deployment checklist one final time, verifying that all equipment was functioning within normal parameters. "Operations, report status," came the captain's voice from across the bridge. "All systems green, Captain. We're ready for departure," Rebecca responded clearly, her voice carrying the confidence that came from thorough preparation. As the USS Meridian slowly pulled away from the dock, Rebecca felt the familiar thrill of being at sea. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, and she knew that the next 6 months would bring challenges that would test every aspect of her training and experience. What she couldn't have anticipated was that her greatest challenge wouldn't come from external threats, but from within her own ship's command structure. The first week at sea passed smoothly, with Rebecca settling into the rhythm of shipboard life. She had worked closely with her team of junior officers and enlisted personnel, familiarizing herself with the ship's specific procedures and protocols. The Meridian had its own unique culture, developed over years of deployments, and she was careful to respect established practices while gradually introducing improvements based on her previous experience. During the morning briefing on their 8th day at sea, Captain Hartwell announced that they would be conducting a major tactical exercise the following day. This would involve coordinating with 2 other ships in their battle group, testing their ability to respond to simulated threats while maintaining formation and communication protocols. Rebecca had been preparing for this exercise since coming aboard, and she felt confident in her team's readiness. Lieutenant Commander Martinez, Hartwell addressed her directly during the briefing. "Your department will be central to the success of this exercise. I expect flawless coordination between all systems." "Understood, Captain. We've run multiple simulations, and I'm confident we're ready," Rebecca replied, noting that several officers around the table were watching her intently. After the briefing, Rebecca returned to her station to review the exercise parameters one final time. The scenario involved responding to a simulated air threat while maintaining defensive positioning relative to the other ships. Her role would be to coordinate radar tracking, communication with the other vessels, and ensuring that all defensive systems were properly aligned and ready to respond. As she worked through the details, Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, the ship's executive officer, approached her station. Morrison was a career officer in his early 40s, known for his attention to detail and strict adherence to protocol. He had been serving as the Meridian's XO for 2 years and was widely respected by the crew for his fairness and competence. Martinez, I wanted to touch base with you about tomorrow's exercise, Morrison said, pulling up a chair beside her console. This will be your first major test with this crew, and I want to make sure you have everything you need. Rebecca appreciated his supportive approach. Thank you, sir. I've been working closely with my team, and we've identified all the key coordination points. I'm particularly focused on ensuring smooth communication with the other ships during the high-stress portions of the exercise. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right priority. The crew will be watching how you handle pressure, especially some of the senior enlisted who have been on this ship for several years. They're good people, but they need to see competence before they'll fully trust a new officer. I understand completely, Rebecca replied. I've been in similar situations before, and I know that trust is earned through consistent performance. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Senior Chief Petty Officer Michael Torres, the ship's most experienced enlisted sailor. Torres had served on the Meridian for 5 years and was widely regarded as the backbone of the ship's operations. He was a man in his late 30s with a weathered face that spoke of countless hours at sea and a reputation for getting things done regardless of the circumstances. "Excuse me, Lieutenant Commander," Torres said, his tone respectful but somewhat reserved. "I wanted to discuss the communication protocols for tomorrow's exercise. Some of the crew have questions about the new procedures you've implemented." Rebecca had expected this conversation. When she first came aboard, she had noticed that some of the communication procedures were outdated and had suggested improvements based on more recent Navy guidelines. While her suggestions were technically correct and would improve efficiency, she understood that change was often met with resistance, particularly from experienced crew members who had been using the same procedures for years. "Of course, Senior Chief. What specific concerns do they have?" Rebecca asked, gesturing for him to sit down. Torres seemed slightly surprised by her welcoming response. "Well, ma'am, the new frequency rotation protocol you've suggested. Some of the radio operators are concerned it might create confusion during high-stress situations. They're comfortable with the current system and worry about making mistakes when things get intense." Rebecca had anticipated this concern and had prepared a response. "I understand their worries and they're valid. However, the new protocol is actually designed to reduce confusion by creating a more logical sequence. Would it help if I spent some time with the radio operators this afternoon, walking through the new system step by step?" "That would be helpful, ma'am," Torres replied, his tone warming slightly. "The crew appreciates officers who take time to explain changes rather than just implementing them." As Torres left, Morrison turned to Rebecca with an approving expression. "That was well handled. You're showing respect for the crew's experience while still maintaining your authority. That's exactly the kind of leadership this ship needs." Rebecca felt a sense of satisfaction at his words. Building trust with the crew was always a delicate balance, requiring confidence in her own expertise while remaining open to learning from those with more experience on the specific ship. She had learned throughout her career that the best leaders were those who could adapt their approach to the unique characteristics of each command. The afternoon training session with the radio operators went smoothly. Rebecca took time to explain not just the new procedures, but also the reasoning behind them, demonstrating how the changes would improve their efficiency and reduce the likelihood of errors during critical situations. By the end of the session, the operators seemed more comfortable with the new system and appeared to appreciate her willingness to address their concerns directly. As evening approached, Rebecca made her way to the mess hall for dinner. The dining area was filled with the usual mix of conversation and camaraderie that characterized mealtime aboard ship. She noticed that several crew members nodded respectfully as she passed, suggesting that word of her afternoon training session had spread and been well received. Sitting with a group of junior officers, Rebecca found herself discussing the upcoming exercise and sharing experiences from her previous assignments. The conversation was professional but relaxed, and she sensed that she was beginning to find her place within the ship's social structure. These relationships were crucial for effective leadership, as they provided the foundation for trust and communication that would be essential during challenging situations. However, as she prepared to leave the mess hall, Rebecca overheard a conversation from a nearby table that gave her pause. Several senior enlisted personnel were discussing the upcoming exercise, and while she couldn't hear all the details, she caught fragments that seemed to express skepticism about her abilities. The tone wasn't openly hostile, but it carried an undercurrent of doubt that she had encountered before in her career. Rather than confronting the situation directly, Rebecca made a mental note to pay attention to these dynamics while focusing on demonstrating her competence through performance. She had learned that the best way to address such concerns was through consistent excellence rather than confrontation. The morning of the tactical exercise dawned clear and calm, with excellent visibility and moderate seas. Rebecca arrived at the bridge an hour before the exercise was scheduled to begin, wanting to ensure that all systems were functioning properly and that her team was fully prepared. The bridge was already bustling with activity as various departments conducted their final preparations. Captain Hartwell was reviewing the exercise parameters with the senior staff, his manner focused and professional. Rebecca noticed that he seemed particularly attentive to details, which she attributed to the importance of the exercise for evaluating the ship's readiness. She had participated in similar exercises throughout her career and understood that they served as crucial tests of both individual competence and collective teamwork. Operations, report status. Hartwell commanded as the exercise start time approached. Rebecca checked her console displays, confirming that all systems were operating within normal parameters. All systems green, Captain. Communications with the other ships are clear, and all defensive systems are online and ready. Very good. Remember, this exercise will test our ability to respond quickly and effectively to multiple threats while maintaining formation. I expect precise coordination from all departments. The exercise began with a simulated radar contact appearing on the screens, representing an incoming air threat. Rebecca immediately began coordinating the response, directing her team to track the contact while simultaneously communicating with the other ships in their formation. The bridge became a hub of controlled activity as various officers carried out their assigned roles. Contact bearing 270, distance 40 nautical miles, closing at high speed, reported the radar operator. Rebecca quickly analyzed the tactical situation, considering the positions of the other ships and the optimal response to the threat. Recommend we adjust formation to defensive posture Bravo, maintain communication link with USS Hartford, and prepare defensive systems for engagement. Captain Hartwell nodded approvingly. Proceed with your recommendation, operations. The next hour passed in a blur of coordinated activity. Rebecca found herself managing multiple information streams simultaneously, tracking the simulated threats, coordinating with the other ships, and ensuring that all defensive systems were properly aligned and ready to respond. Her team performed excellently, demonstrating the value of their extensive preparation and training. During a particularly challenging portion of the exercise, when multiple threats appeared simultaneously, Rebecca noticed that one of the communication links with the other ships was experiencing interference. Rather than simply reporting the problem, she quickly identified an alternative frequency and re-established clear communication within minutes. This rapid problem-solving prevented what could have been a significant degradation in their tactical effectiveness. Excellent work, operations, Captain Hartwell commented as the exercise concluded. Your quick thinking on the communication issue prevented a major problem. Rebecca felt a surge of satisfaction at the successful completion of the exercise. Her team had performed flawlessly, and she had demonstrated the kind of competence and leadership that she hoped would earn the respect of both officers and crew. The exercise had tested every aspect of her training and experience, and she felt confident that she had met the challenge successfully. As the ship returned to normal operations, Rebecca began conducting a thorough post-exercise review with her team. This was a crucial part of the learning process, allowing them to identify areas for improvement and reinforce successful practices. The review revealed that while their overall performance had been excellent, there were several minor areas where they could enhance their efficiency. Overall, I'm very pleased with how we performed, Rebecca told her team. The rapid response to the communication issue was particularly impressive, and it showed that our preparation and training paid off. However, I want us to focus on improving our initial threat assessment procedures. We were about 30 seconds slower than optimal in our first response. The team members nodded, appreciating her balanced approach of acknowledging their success while identifying opportunities for improvement. This type of constructive feedback was essential for maintaining high standards and ensuring continued professional development. Later that afternoon, Rebecca was surprised to receive a message requesting her presence in Captain Hartwell's quarters. Such meetings were not unusual, but the timing seemed significant given that they had just completed a major exercise. She knocked on the captain's door and entered when invited. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez, please have a seat," Hartwell said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. His manner seemed more formal than usual, which caused Rebecca to wonder about the purpose of the meeting. "Thank you, Captain. I hope you were satisfied with our performance during the exercise," Rebecca began, assuming that this was likely the topic of their conversation. Hartwell leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before responding. "Your technical performance was adequate, Martinez. Your team executed the required procedures correctly, and you handled the communication issue competently." Rebecca noticed that his praise seemed somewhat restrained, particularly given the positive comments he had made immediately after the exercise. "I appreciate that, Captain. Is there something specific you'd like me to focus on for future exercises?" "Actually, there is something I want to discuss," Hartwell said, his tone becoming more serious. "I've been receiving some feedback from crew members about your approach to leadership. Some concerns have been raised about your interactions with the enlisted personnel." This was unexpected, and Rebecca felt a moment of confusion. "I'm sorry, Captain, but I'm not sure what you're referring to. Could you be more specific about these concerns?" Hartwell seemed to consider his words carefully. "Some of the senior enlisted personnel have suggested that you may be overstepping your authority in certain situations. There's a feeling that you're trying to change too many established procedures too quickly." Rebecca was genuinely surprised by this feedback. Her interactions with the crew had seemed positive, and she had been careful to introduce changes gradually and with appropriate explanation. "Captain, I've tried to be respectful of established procedures while implementing improvements based on current Navy guidelines. I've also made sure to explain the reasoning behind any changes to ensure crew understanding and buy-in." "I understand that was your intention," Hartwell replied, "but perception is important on a ship like this. The crew has been working together for a long time, and they may be resistant to change, particularly from a new officer." Rebecca felt a growing sense of unease about the direction of this conversation. While she understood the importance of crew dynamics, she was confident that her approach had been appropriate and professional. "I appreciate the feedback, Captain, and I'm certainly willing to adjust my approach if necessary. However, I'd like to understand the specific situations that have caused concern so that I can address them appropriately." Hartwell's expression remained neutral, but Rebecca sensed a subtle shift in his demeanor. "I think it would be best if you took a more measured approach to implementing changes. Sometimes it's better to maintain stability rather than pushing for improvements that might create friction." This comment struck Rebecca as particularly troubling. Throughout her career, she had been trained to continuously seek improvements and to implement best practices regardless of resistance to change. The idea that she should avoid making beneficial improvements to avoid creating friction seemed to contradict fundamental principles of naval leadership. "I understand the importance of maintaining crew cohesion, Captain," Rebecca replied carefully. "But I also believe that we have a responsibility to implement improvements that enhance our operational effectiveness. I'm confident that the changes I've suggested are based on sound principles and will ultimately benefit the ship." Hartwell's expression hardened slightly. "Martinez, I think you may be misunderstanding the dynamics of this particular command. This isn't a classroom or a staff assignment where you can simply implement textbook solutions. This is a working warship with a crew that has developed effective procedures through years of experience." Rebecca felt a flash of irritation at the implication that her suggestions were merely textbook solutions, but she maintained her professional composure. "I respect the crew's experience, Captain, and I've tried to incorporate their knowledge into my recommendations. However, I also bring 15 years of naval experience and expertise that I believe can contribute to our effectiveness." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Hartwell emphasizing the importance of maintaining crew harmony, while Rebecca defended her approach to leadership and continuous improvement. By the end of the meeting, Rebecca felt that she had defended her position appropriately, but she also sensed that something had fundamentally shifted in her relationship with the commanding officer. As she left the captain's quarters, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than simply concerns about crew dynamics. The timing of the feedback, coming immediately after a successful exercise, seemed suspicious. Moreover, the vague nature of the complaints and the reluctance to provide specific examples suggested that the real issues might be quite different from what had been presented. Walking back to her quarters, Rebecca began mentally reviewing her interactions with the crew over the past week. While she acknowledged that some sailors might need time to adjust to new procedures, she was confident that her approach had been professional and appropriate. The success of the morning's exercise seemed to contradict any suggestion that her leadership was creating problems. That evening, as she prepared for sleep, Rebecca found herself reflecting on similar situations she had encountered throughout her career. She had learned that being a woman in a male-dominated profession sometimes meant facing additional scrutiny and having to prove herself repeatedly. While she had hoped that such attitudes were becoming less common, she suspected that they might be playing a role in the current situation. Despite her concerns, Rebecca was determined to continue performing at the highest level and to maintain her commitment to excellence. She had worked too hard and come too far to allow unfounded criticism to undermine her confidence or her dedication to serving effectively. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same professionalism and competence that had brought her to this point in her career. The next morning brought a subtle but noticeable change in the atmosphere aboard the Meridian. Rebecca arrived at the bridge for the morning watch to find that several crew members who had previously been friendly and professional now seemed more distant and formal. The change was not dramatic, but it was enough to make her aware that something had shifted in the ship's social dynamics. During the morning briefing, Captain Hartwell's manner toward her remained professional but noticeably cooler than it had been in previous days. He directed most of his questions and comments to other officers, and when he did address her, his tone was more formal and less collegial than before. Rebecca maintained her professional demeanor, but she was acutely aware of the changed atmosphere. Senior Chief Torres approached her station after the briefing, his manner more reserved than it had been during their previous interactions. "Lieutenant Commander, I wanted to discuss the watch schedule for next week. Some of the crew have requested modifications to their assignments." Rebecca reviewed the proposed changes, noting that they would actually reduce the efficiency of their operations without providing any apparent benefits. "Senior Chief, I don't see how these changes would improve our effectiveness. In fact, they might create some gaps in our coverage during critical periods." Torres seemed uncomfortable with her response. "Well, ma'am, the crew feels that the current schedule is demanding. They're concerned about fatigue affecting their performance." This was puzzling to Rebecca, as the current schedule was actually less demanding than standard Navy practices, and well within normal parameters for shipboard operations. I understand the importance of managing fatigue, Senior Chief, but our current schedule is already quite reasonable. Perhaps we could discuss specific concerns with individual crew members. "I'll pass that along, ma'am," Torres replied, but his tone suggested that he was not entirely satisfied with her response. As the day progressed, Rebecca noticed several other small incidents that seemed to indicate a coordinated effort to question her decisions and authority. Equipment that had been functioning properly suddenly developed problems that required her attention. Communication procedures that had been working smoothly began experiencing difficulties that disrupted operations. While none of these issues were major, their cumulative effect was to create an impression that her leadership was somehow causing problems. During lunch, Rebecca sat with Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, a fellow officer who had been friendly and supportive since Rebecca's arrival. Walsh was the ship's communications officer, a competent professional who had served on the Meridian for 18 months. Her manner was typically straightforward and honest, which Rebecca appreciated. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something," Walsh said quietly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "There's been some talk among the crew about your leadership style. I'm not sure where it's coming from, but I thought you should know." Rebecca appreciated the warning, though she was not entirely surprised. "What kind of talk are you hearing?" "Nothing specific, really. Just general comments about how things were different before you arrived. Suggestions that maybe you're pushing too hard for changes. It's not coming from everyone, but it's definitely circulating." This confirmed Rebecca's suspicions that the previous day's conversation with Captain Hartwell was part of a larger pattern. "Do you have any sense of who might be driving these conversations?" Walsh hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I don't want to make accusations, but I've noticed that some of the senior enlisted personnel seem to be less enthusiastic about your presence than they initially were." Rebecca nodded, appreciating Walsh's honesty while understanding her reluctance to be more specific. "I appreciate you telling me this, Jennifer. It helps me understand what I'm dealing with." That afternoon, Rebecca decided to take a proactive approach to addressing the situation. She scheduled individual meetings with several key crew members, intending to discuss any concerns directly and to reinforce her commitment to working collaboratively with the entire crew. She began with Petty Officer First Class David Chen, one of the senior radar operators who had been working with her closely on the new communication procedures. Chen was a skilled technician in his late 20s who had been serving on the Meridian for 3 years. He had initially seemed enthusiastic about the procedural improvements Rebecca had suggested, and his technical competence was well regarded throughout the ship. However, when he arrived for their meeting, His manner was noticeably more reserved than it had been previously. "Petty Officer Chen, I wanted to check in with you about how the new communication procedures are working," Rebecca began, hoping to establish a comfortable atmosphere for their discussion. "They're working fine, ma'am," Chen replied, his tone neutral but somehow less engaged than she had expected. "I'm glad to hear that. I know that changing established procedures can be challenging, and I appreciate your willingness to adapt to the new system." Chen nodded but didn't elaborate, which was unusual for him. Typically, he was quite talkative about technical matters and eager to discuss improvements and optimizations. "Is there anything about the new procedures that you think we could improve, or any concerns that you'd like to discuss?" Rebecca asked, trying to draw him out. "No, ma'am. Everything is working as designed." The conversation continued in this manner for several more minutes, with Chen providing only minimal responses to her questions. While he remained respectful and professional, it was clear that something had changed in his attitude toward her. When the meeting concluded, Rebecca felt frustrated by her inability to identify the specific cause of the change or to address whatever concerns might be underlying his new reserve. Similar patterns emerged in her meetings with other crew members throughout the afternoon. Personnel who had previously been engaged and communicative now provided only brief, formal responses. While no one was openly disrespectful or insubordinate, the collective effect was to create an atmosphere of distance and subtle resistance. By evening, Rebecca was beginning to feel isolated and uncertain about how to address the situation. She had encountered resistance to change before in her career, but this felt different, more systematic and coordinated than typical adjustment difficulties. The timing, coming immediately after a successful exercise, suggested that the issues were not related to her professional competence. That night, Rebecca spent considerable time reviewing her actions and decisions since coming aboard the Meridian. She examined every interaction, every decision, every change she had implemented, looking for anything that might have justified the negative response she was experiencing. While she could identify a few minor issues that she might have handled differently, nothing seemed to warrant the level of resistance she was encountering. As she prepared for sleep, Rebecca found herself questioning whether she was being overly sensitive to normal crew dynamics. Perhaps the changes in attitude were not as significant as they seemed, or perhaps they were simply the result of natural adjustment processes that would resolve themselves over time. However, her instincts and experience suggested that something more deliberate was occurring. The next morning brought a new challenge that would test Rebecca's resolve and professionalism. She arrived at the bridge to find that the night watch had experienced several equipment failures that had not been properly documented or reported through normal channels. This was highly unusual, as the ship's maintenance procedures were typically meticulous and comprehensive. "What's the status of the radar system?" Rebecca asked the officer she was relieving. "We had some intermittent problems during the night," he replied, "but the technicians said they couldn't identify the specific cause. It seems to be working now, but you might want to keep an eye on it." Rebecca immediately began investigating the reported problems, working with the technical staff to understand what had occurred and to ensure that all systems were functioning properly. What she discovered was troubling. The reported failures were inconsistent with the equipment's maintenance records and operational history. Moreover, the symptoms described by the night watch didn't match any known failure patterns for the equipment involved. As she delved deeper into the investigation, Rebecca began to suspect that the equipment problems might not have been genuine failures at all. The timing and nature of the reported issues suggested that they might have been manufactured to create the impression that her leadership was somehow causing operational problems. This possibility was deeply disturbing, as it would represent a serious breach of military discipline and professionalism. If crew members were deliberately creating false problems to undermine her authority, it would constitute a form of sabotage that could potentially endanger the ship and its mission. However, Rebecca also understood that she needed to be careful about making such accusations without concrete evidence. The consequences of being wrong would be severe, potentially damaging her career and relationships with the crew. She decided to continue investigating while maintaining her professional responsibilities and avoiding any appearance of paranoia or overreaction. Throughout the day, Rebecca found herself in the difficult position of trying to perform her duties effectively while simultaneously monitoring for signs of deliberate sabotage or resistance. This dual focus was exhausting and stressful, but she was determined not to let the situation compromise her professional performance or her commitment to the ship's mission. The situation aboard the USS Meridian continued to deteriorate over the following days, with Rebecca finding herself increasingly isolated from both the crew and the ship's senior leadership. What had begun as subtle resistance to her authority had evolved into a more systematic pattern of undermining her effectiveness and questioning her competence. The stress of the situation was beginning to affect her sleep and concentration, but she remained determined to maintain her professional standards and find a way to address the underlying issues. During the morning briefing on her 10th day aboard the ship, Captain Hartwell announced that they would be conducting a surprise inspection of all departments. Such inspections were not unusual, but the timing seemed significant given the recent tensions. Rebecca suspected that the inspection might be related to the ongoing questions about her leadership, and she was determined to ensure that her department would perform flawlessly. I want all departments to be ready for a comprehensive review of their procedures and readiness," Hartwell announced. "This inspection will cover everything from equipment maintenance to personnel training records. I expect nothing less than perfect compliance with all Navy regulations." Rebecca spent the remainder of the morning working with her team to prepare for the inspection. She reviewed all documentation, checked equipment status, and ensured that every aspect of their operations would meet the highest standards. Her team responded professionally, but she noticed that their enthusiasm seemed somewhat muted compared to their previous interactions. The inspection began that afternoon, with a team of senior officers conducting a thorough review of each department. When they reached Rebecca's area of responsibility, she was confident that everything would be found in perfect order. However, as the inspection proceeded, the team began identifying what they claimed were deficiencies in her department's operations. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez," said Commander Robert Sterling, the inspection team leader, "we've identified several areas where your procedures don't seem to align with standard Navy protocols." Rebecca was genuinely surprised by this assessment. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Commander. We've been following all established procedures, and I've implemented improvements based on current Navy guidelines." Sterling consulted his notes. "For example, your communication log entries don't follow the standard format specified in the manual. Additionally, some of your equipment maintenance schedules appear to deviate from recommended intervals." Rebecca reviewed the specific items he was citing, and she was confused by his interpretations. "Commander, I believe there may be a misunderstanding. These procedures are actually more comprehensive than the minimum standards, and they're based on best practices I've learned from previous assignments." "Perhaps that's the problem," Sterling replied. "This ship has established procedures that have worked effectively for years. Implementing changes without proper authorization could be seen as exceeding your authority." The conversation continued in this manner for nearly an hour, with Sterling and his team identifying numerous supposed deficiencies that Rebecca believed were actually improvements to existing procedures. By the end of the inspection, she felt frustrated and confused by what seemed to be a deliberate misinterpretation of her actions and decisions. Later that evening, Rebecca was summoned to another meeting with Captain Hartwell. This time, Executive Officer Morrison was also present, and the atmosphere in the room was noticeably more formal and tense than their previous meetings. "Martinez, I'm concerned about the results of today's inspection," Hartwell began without preamble. "Commander Sterling's team identified several areas where your department's performance was found to be unsatisfactory." Rebecca felt a surge of frustration, but she maintained her professional composure. "Captain, I respectfully disagree with that assessment. I believe the inspection team may have misunderstood the improvements I've implemented. Everything we're doing is within regulations and actually exceeds minimum standards. Morrison leaned forward. The issue isn't whether your procedures are technically within regulations. The problem is that you're implementing changes without considering their impact on ship operations and crew morale. With respect, sir, I have considered those impacts, Rebecca replied. I've taken time to explain changes to the crew, and I've been careful to implement improvements gradually. The procedures I've established are based on proven best practices. Hartwell's expression remained stern. Martinez, I think you're missing the point. This isn't about whether your ideas are theoretically sound. It's about whether you're demonstrating the kind of leadership that's appropriate for this command. Rebecca felt as though she was being criticized for doing exactly what she had been trained to do throughout her career. Captain, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking of me. I've been implementing standard Navy procedures and working to improve our operational effectiveness. What I'm asking, Hartwell said, his tone becoming more pointed, is that you recognize that leadership on a ship like this requires different skills than what you might have learned in staff assignments or training environments. You need to adapt your approach to fit the culture and expectations of this crew. This comment struck Rebecca as particularly unfair, given that she had spent the majority of her career in operational assignments and had successfully led personnel in various challenging environments. The implication that she lacked experience in real leadership was both inaccurate and insulting. I understand the importance of adapting to different environments, Rebecca replied carefully. But I also believe that effective leadership requires maintaining high standards and implementing improvements when they're warranted. I'm confident that the changes I've made will ultimately benefit the ship. Morrison shook his head. Martinez, you're not listening to what we're telling you. The crew is losing confidence in your leadership, and that's creating problems that affect the entire ship. I'm sorry, sir, but I haven't seen evidence of widespread crew dissatisfaction, Rebecca responded. While there may be some resistance to change, I believe that's normal and will resolve itself as the crew sees the benefits of the improvements. Hartwell stood up, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. Martinez, I want you to think carefully about what we've discussed. Your performance over the next few weeks will be closely monitored, and I expect to see significant improvements in your approach to leadership. As Rebecca left the meeting, she felt a deep sense of frustration and confusion. She was being criticized for implementing exactly the kind of leadership and procedural improvements that had been rewarded throughout her career. The suggestion that she should lower her standards or avoid making beneficial changes seemed to contradict fundamental principles of military leadership. That night, Rebecca spent considerable time reviewing her situation and considering her options. She could attempt to comply with the captain's apparent preference for maintaining the status quo, even if it meant accepting suboptimal procedures. Alternatively, she could continue to push for improvements while trying to address the concerns about crew relationships. Neither option seemed satisfactory to her. Compromising her professional standards felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked for throughout her career. However, continuing to face escalating resistance from the command structure could potentially damage her career and effectiveness. As she reflected on the situation, Rebecca began to suspect that the real issues might be quite different from what was being presented to her. The systematic nature of the criticism, the timing of the inspection, and the apparent coordination of crew resistance suggested that something more deliberate might be occurring. The possibility that she was facing discrimination based on her gender was something she had hoped to avoid, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The pattern of criticism, questioning her authority, suggesting that she was not suited for ship command, implying that her experience was inadequate, or was consistent with the kind of subtle bias that women in military leadership positions sometimes encountered.